Welcome to Interplay Conversations in Music. This is Michael Shapiro with my special guest, Carlos Kalmar, conductor extraordinaire, speaking to me from, where are you today?
I'm in Shaker Heights, meaning I'm in Cleveland.
That's okay. I know Cleveland very, very well. Old friends with Franklin Cohen, who is living not so far from you.
I know Frank is one of my faculty colleagues.
That's correct, which we'll talk about at Cleveland Institute of Music. But I want to talk about Carlos Kalmar, the conductor and musician who has been around for quite a long time, whose work is throughout all the major orchestras in Europe and here, and also your wonderful work with the Oregon Symphony over many decades, and now also at Cleveland, but also Grant Park and that summer series you've been holding in Chicago for so many years. But let's step back. You've been an active professional conductor for decades. You're almost a contemporary of me, a bit older. But tell me the difference now. I mean, you are going to be teaching at Cleveland Institute, which is a new thing for you. I think you've taught before, but never in such a concentrated way. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. And I would say the difference is apparent within nearly six weeks, 10 weeks of experience with the students. You know, I have a very, very long experience, just what I call building orchestras, meaning finding an orchestra wherever I find the orchestra and just taking it to a different level by constantly working and constantly kind of refining what is there, building on their strengths, etc., etc. And now I am in an environment where I technically want to do the same, but I am very aware that a certain number of students who are right now with me and have been working with me for the last 5 months are not going to be there next years, and they are going to be replaced by freshmen and all the newcomers who have never worked with me. So it's this process of building doesn't really exist. It's also one of the biggest differences, which of course comes, I would say, with, it's the only time I mention the word age, is that when you work with professional orchestras, you can rely on their experience no matter what and where in their career they are, meaning they know the A, B, and C of orchestra playing. Whereas when you are in an environment where you are teaching and you're working with students, there might be students there whose experience as orchestra players is very, very limited, and they don't really know what to look for in an orchestra. And that is one of the parts where I'm teaching them, aside from it, of course, exposing them to any repertoire and any style that I can even think of so that they become complete musicians. But it's different.
Now, let's go to specifics, if I may, because there'll be students watching this. I talk from my own experience, and then I want to learn about yours. I studied conducting with two people. Now, I'm a composer who conducts, not a conductor who composes. But I studied with two people conducting. I studied with Karl Bamberger, that shows my age, the great Austrian conductor, and teacher at Mannes for over 40 years. A musician, great musician about musical qualities, but not a technician. Then I studied much later with Harold Farberman at Bard, who was strictly a technician, strictly how to hold the baton, how to hold the arm, how not to have a lot of motions, moving your head, moving your ears, you know. What's going to be your approach at CIM, or is your approach? And your background, I'd be curious.
So I studied with two teachers in Vienna in Austria, and I actually went from one to the other. So I started with Karl Randolph at the Conservatory of Music. Mm-hmm. A wonderful man. I would say he was a little bit of the older, wise man, because at that time I had no experience. I had never had proper training. I had conducted, but no proper training. And he could have beaten me up without even blinking. I made a lot of musical mistakes and which you have when you're very young, a lot of very crazy ideas. But he pretty much let me be and kind of he let me grow in one direction and kind of shaped off the branches that went too crazy to the side. And later I studied with Karl Österreicher, Karl Österreicher was the successor of the great Hans Swarovski.
Yes, of course.
Karl Österreicher was the more technical side of things, not only, but mostly that is what I took. And I always joked that that of course not all his students made it to be conductors. Mm-hmm. Some just veered off and did something completely different. It's just it's nobody's fault. It's how it goes. However, I can say that all of us could conduct, all of us, meaning technically just keeping an orchestra together and just showing certain things, they were all good. And Karl Österreicher was, of course, very, very healthy for me, because that is where I learned kind of the technical side of conducting.
Now, let's talk about, you're a pianist originally?
Oh, hell no.
Hell no. So what is your instrument?
No, it's one of my very many weaknesses is I'm a violinist.
Well, it's not a weakness. You know how to deal with strings, which many pianists don't know.
Yeah, I always say that one of my biggest advantages was in terms of, and I still cherish it now, 37 years later, I cherish the fact that I sat in an orchestra for quite a while as a substitute in Vienna. I have quite an experience playing the violin in an orchestra.
Wow.
Other part that I cherish very, very much is during my student times in Vienna, I was also the choir director for 2 choruses, amateur choruses.
Excellent, excellent.
Wonderful training.
Training about breath.
Not only that, but training of
shape.
When you actually conduct and you have to work with people who are not musicians, and to adjust your vocabulary and get the best out of them.
Right.
Try to be motivational, etc. It's an important step, because I don't recall that it was that way, but I would always say you come off your high horse and you deal with the reality. And the reality was wonderful. I still remember to this day that just at the very end of my what you call tenure as choir director, did in both cases, I unified them, and I did the E-flat major mass by Franz Schubert, which is a work that here in the United States, not many people know. They should.
The masses are amazing.
The masses are incredible, and E-flat major is just, it's beyond belief. It's the quality of the unfinished.
You know, Bomberger, my teacher, told me as a kid, his daddy who was Catholic, used to take the little Jewish Austrian boy to the Hofburg Capella, I think it was, on the weekends, on Sundays, to hear Schubert and Mozart and Haydn masses performed by the Vienna Choir Boys and the Vienna Philharmonic. Those were the days, right?
Yeah, essentially, that was the way to get people to attend mass. You just tell them the music is going to be good.
That's right.
People were like, I'm not into religion, but you said, hey, come on. Coronation Mass by Mozart, pretty good.
I'll go. Who's conducting? Yeah. You've interesting background. Now, your folks fled Europe I assume because of the Holocaust.
Yes, they did.
And they settled in South America.
Yes.
Which is a story I very much know about in my background as well, and from Bomberger especially. And did they speak German in the household, or Spanish?
They spoke both. So I grew up with 2 languages from the get-go. The interesting thing about the language is that, of course, I was born in Uruguay. which was for my parents the second country they went, because they ended up fleeing the Holocaust. They ended up in Bolivia, where we met. At the time, we are talking 1938.
That's the
My
year.
mother was 10, so my mother completed high school in Bolivia, and that is why my mother spoke without any accent Spanish, because she went to school there and she had an interesting ear for that. For music, no ear, but different story. And my dad, who was 10 years her senior, always spoke with an accent. In that home, we spoke everything.
It's fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
But they were an Austrian family originally?
Yeah, my parents were from Vienna in Austria, and they escaped right after. I mean, they didn't know each other at that time. They escaped after Reichskristallnacht.
Yeah.
Left the country.
Oh, boy. In any event, your musical studies in Uruguay were where?
I studied privately. My parents noticed they always were interested in taking their boys, my brother and myself, to concerts, and they noticed that I have kind of a certain interest for it.
I would say
Whether I want to study an instrument. I remember this when they asked me, and I only could name really specifically 2 instruments. For whatever reason, I didn't connect to things like it's a cello or it's a flute. I knew it's a violin, it's a piano. So pick one. I picked the violin, and I studied privately.
Privately.
Yes.
Good enough to be a sub player in Vienna later. What got you to Vienna?
Well, what essentially got us to Vienna was that I would say the main reason was that my brother and I were poised to study something that you cannot study in Uruguay. My brother had this idea of becoming a teacher of a certain kind, and I wanted to become a musician, but we would have to travel to Europe. And my parents simply didn't like the idea of splitting the family, because they thought, rightly so, that if their boys go, they are going to see their boys once a year, and that's it. And
Especially that distance, yeah.
Yeah, and they didn't want to do that, and so they took the risk. I still admire that fact that voluntarily they moved the entire family, us 4, to Europe, and succeeded and settled in Vienna, of all places, and lived there, I would say, happily ever after.
What year was that, do you know?
That was 1973.
We could have met, because I was in Vienna in 74.
Ah!
A lot of stories to talk about. In the, a lot of stories. I remember the Bezirk I lived in and so forth. In any event, getting back to conducting, which I find fascinating talking to you with your experience. Now you're going to teach the practical life you have led, will continue to lead, I should say, going forward. What repertoire will you focus on with your students? Do you know?
I will focus on any repertoire that allows the students to grow, and I will try to. I mean, you have to understand that my conducting students, where I'm aiming at, are not the beginners. So I don't teach the A, B, and C. What I want to do is to teach them how to use and rely their technical abilities in an environment of professional musicianship, so that they can have the aptitude of working with their hands and their expression in such a way that they don't have to constantly interrupt the orchestra and the flow of rehearsal, which is very interesting. And I also would love to, over time, teach them what I call rehearsal technique, because I remember myself very, very vividly that in my very last week as a student, I also participated in the Hans Zorowski International Competition. And I remember that I got to the finals and I had a rehearsal with the radio orchestra and I did Beethoven 4. And I did my rehearsal and then I sent everybody for coffee, meaning let's have a break. And I was pacing there in the hallway of the Vienna Concerthaus and Maestro Ludovit Reiter, who was for years the chief conductor of Slovakian Philharmonic, and who at that time was, I think, already 8 years. He stopped me there, very fine, kind man, I remember him vividly, and said, Kalmar, listen, you are very talented, but you have to stop talking. And I thought, of course, I was shocked, but over the years, I remember this very well. And I thought, great advice, because most of the time, we young conductors, we talk way too much.
Well, that's the famous thing that Beecham says in his interview, which you've probably seen. With the Royal Philharmonic, I go straight through. Go back, do your spots. Young conductors stop. They tell the Royal Philharmonic what to do. He says they played it 78 times more than that conductor's ever picked up a baton.
Exactly. I mean, of course, that is, in terms of Sir Thomas, that's slightly on purpose overdone.
Oh, no question.
but in a way, it's very, very. And I think that when it happens that a conductor has the technical tools and the knowledge that he doesn't need to interrupt an orchestra all the time, and he can develop a sense of flow.
Yes.
If I can teach my students something that goes into that direction, then I will have done my job.
Maestro, I want to talk to you about knowledge of music, because this is what I got from Bombega. Phrasing. Something, flow, turning that melody, understanding where people like this come from. It's not a natural thing for some. I think playing chamber music is very important, accompanying singers. You as a violinist must have played a lot of string quartets and quintets and sextets in your life. So you understand the interplay, no? Using the term of this show. Don't you think that's part of the training that a conductor must have? Always?
Oh, no. I think it's the part of the training that a musician must have.
There we go.
A conductor in particular, that is also one of the focal points. Because, I mean, the easiest way for me to explain it just in a very general way is if we all would understand making music, conducting, as utilizing speech, which, and in a language, no matter what language you speak, there is a certain melody, and you will kind of you're aiming towards certain words without even thinking, and that I always, most of the time, I would say 90% of the time, I look for where does phrasing actually go, because phrasing goes somewhere. I just have to figure out where it goes, and very often we can butt our heads and discuss essentially not only where it goes, but we might have different opinions, and then we'll talk about that.
That's okay, but at least know how to phrase.
At least know what you're saying. And I am, this is not a criticism of the students, because I have not yet had my own students. I will next year. But I'm sometimes amazed by the fact that musicians don't really know where does a phrase go, meaning what do I want to say? And what I want to do is essentially help them. And I have to remember that at all times, help them to find their ways. Because, as a teacher, with a lot of experience on your shoulders, you are always in danger of telling the student, this is how it's done. Just I tell you, this is how you phrase, etc. And trust me, I am very opinionated. I have a very clear idea, but I have to, as a teacher, I think you have to help the student, this young musician, to find their way. And
Okay.
yes,
Let's talk about this guy's 40th symphony.
that guy.
That guy. His 40th symphony, first movement.
Yup.
Okay. Choice of tempo for your students. What if they go too quick or too slow? What are you doing? How do you teach them how to, that E flat to the D, how do you teach them to do it? What would you do? What's the tempo? How do we choose it?
That guy, 40th Symphony, first movement.
Yes, let's do that.
I mean, I would, my thinking, first of all, do not take it too slow.
Okay.
Not a good, to me, not a good idea, because I think the expression of the first movement, when it starts, it's a little bit of uneasiness, of urgency, amongst other things. So this ta ta ti ti ta ti ti ta ta, it should not sit, because then if it sits, the ti da dam ba da dam ti da da rin, it's very no. It just, it doesn't express what I think Mozart wanted, and I think that it also, I think, if you, and I don't think that what I have in mind is so insanely fast, but when you don't go slow, it helps you to shape the bigger picture, because one thing, and we are kind of touching the topic, is we talk about the phrasing, which is the little sentences. But let's talk, I don't even say the poem. Let's talk about the verse, 4 verses, for something like that. And you have to have a sense of how to shape that. And you have to have a structural idea of how to shape the entire thing, etc., etc., etc. I mean, with that guy, but I am an absolute sucker for, because I remember Beethoven said that. First, I read many times that whenever there was a concert about his music, the first question for him was, how were the tempi?
Yeah.
And I thought, like, okay, there you have it. And I am very, very meticulous in terms of thinking what is the tempo. And of course, the thing with whether it's that guy behind you.
For listeners watching this, Mozart's 40th Symphony in G minor we're talking about. Continue, Maestro.
So Mozart, 40th Symphony, first movement. Of course, now there are probably, I don't know about that symphony, there are easily 200 recordings available. Easily. And I would guess around 25 of them are really very good. So, and they are very, very different. I mean, we're talking Mozart 40, so you will have people not that I've never heard whether he recorded it, but I assume I would know how he does it. My dear colleague Bruno Weil, who was director of Tafelmusik in Canada, I think Canadian, who will be quite faster than I even think.
Oh, absolutely.
And on the other side, you have, I'm sure he recorded it, Otto Klemperer. And that's... Yeah.
Many Klemperer stories, by the way. This is fascinating.
So do I. And the thing is, just, yes, I am always in favor. If you want, just listen. Don't be shy. Just don't copy, because you are not that. I remember when I was very young, I, of course, was fascinated with Klemperer and his approach and the majesty of his music.
Oh, my God. So much of it.
Yeah, and then I tried to kind of mimic that, which didn't get me anywhere, because I'm not the emperor.
Well, you're also not 6'7", no?
I'm slightly short. I'm slightly shorter,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
okay, now I'm in a few years I get to that famous age.
I know when we shrink. I was 6'1". I'm not 6'1" anymore. But I should not mention. I'm curious about choice of repertoire. Not only what you'll do at school, but what you've done for so many years. One thing I'm noticing as a composer of newly composed music, or music I've written throughout my career, is that the management seems to have more control over choice of programming with merchandising and marketing and this department and that committee and this and that. And the musicians, especially the conductors, have less say than Eugene Ormandy or Leopold Stokowski had. Do you see that changing?
I would love to say that the answer is no. Of course, if you mention Ormandy or the likes, well, that is really the past. We have that has changed ever since. I like to think, and I would like to give that message also to young conductors and students alike, that we as music directors, not as guest conductors, as music directors, owe it to ourselves and in particular the industry, especially here in the United States, that we have what I call a financial conscience. Mm-hmm. Music directors, meaning be aware that the amount of money you make by your programming is absolutely crucial for the health of the institution. So if you are going to plan in whatever orchestra, you're the music director of a series of Schoenberg, Berg, Webern, followed by, just to name a few, are amazing, stunning composers. You might have great concerts in front of a fairly empty hall, and your marketing department and your president might not like it. And that's where it comes to a clash. So I have worked my entire career, especially the last, I would say, 25 years, on creating programs that feed the needs of pretty much everybody. Meaning you stretch in different directions and you give, you are aware that there is a certain amount of your audience that wants to hear the well-ridden war horses that are war horses for a reason, by the way. Don't get me wrong. I love to conduct Dvorak 9 or Beethoven 5 or Tchaikovsky 4. They are amazing. Best works ever written, amongst others. But I also like to take the audience into a direction where they have never been. And I think over time that you try to create with your audience a trust, so that the audience knows that even if there is something on the plate that they have never eaten, it's going to be really, really interesting, and they are going to take away something from that. And that, in consequence, will be at all times, will be accepted, mm-hmm. the management, and cherished by the board. I remember specifically when the crisis, the economic crisis of, 14 years ago, give or take, mm-hmm. hit. We were in jeopardy in Oregon, as everybody else was, but we were having a hard time. And I got a little bit of pressure from the board in terms of changing my programs. And we settled because instead of changing the programs, I mixed it up in a certain way. Mm-hmm. And I provided something to the board, to the people in the office, and to the audience, which is called context. Meaning, you probably realize I like to talk about music.
It's fine.
And as my wife likes to say, don't give him a microphone, he never stops talking. Or if you give him a microphone, tell him it's 3 minutes and then shut up.
Well, we only have a half an hour, but...
Anyway, if you tell the audience something,
Mm-hmm.
they will relate to the piece in a very different way.
No question about it. Yes.
And that's what I have been doing. And
Yes.
that's how I would say I averted the danger of marketing professional residents, etc., taking over a part of my program. So I must say that I was very lucky. I've never had a fight, meaning have to, no, we do this because I want, no. I was always very like, I'm very team oriented, and I always was very understanding. So
of course.
what I also say, and I say that to, I don't know whether it's musicians in general, but conductor colleagues who are taking over an orchestra, please don't blow through your budget in barely 2 concerts, because what is there to be left? Just be financially responsible as a musician, and you will do very well.
Well, there's certainly things you can impart to your young students. This is part of the life. Why does certain music last? Talk to the alive composers. You're a conductor of years of experience. Certain music that's being written now by my colleagues, as it were, will last. A little bit of it will, and most of it won't. Why?
If I could answer that.
No, don't. You know the reasons. Talk about specifics. Why does the Brahms Symphony grab us, or Dvorak 9? Why do they grab us while, I don't know, a Moscheles piece doesn't grab us? Or, Kalkbrenner or some other person doesn't grab us, but Chopin does. Why? Why does it happen? I think about this all the time as a 71-year-old composer.
I don't think I can answer that question in a way that is satisfying. But as a colleague of many, many wonderful composers, I see the problem that composers run into, which is so many things have already been said in music. So composers are bound to find their way that has not been traveled yet. Number 2, which is a topic we could probably expand for another 15 minutes, should an art form in general, music included, reflect the times in which we live? Because for me, the answer is, oh, yeah. And lastly, which doesn't reflect what neither Brahms nor Dvorak, amongst others, did, is it's music. It's classical music. What you hear in a concert actually there for entertainment. What is entertainment anyway? So if you put all of that together, you run into, as a composer, to so many problems. And I am fascinated about the fact that pieces survive, probably for a reason, while others don't. And if I would know which one of the current composers are going to be played in 50 years when I'm already gone, I would know things that I actually don't have an answer for. Of course, I believe to some extent that a certain style of music peaked at a certain time. And that is where we get the best composers that we play over and over. And those composers speak to humanity no matter what. The comprehensiveness of those composers is absolutely stunning. I think, and I don't say that as an explanation, but it's helpful, and we touched on that, if occasionally you give an explanation to people about what they are going to hear or why or something. Just a little hint. With music by Mr. Beethoven or Mr. Dvorak or the Tchaikovsky or Mozart or Bach, you essentially don't need that explanation. It just for itself.
You will
And that is a
conduct-
problem that trust me, I have done, I wouldn't say that much, but I've done quite a number of world premieres.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to world premieres, what I really want to do is I want to giving birth to something that actually can walk by itself. Meaning, the worst thing that I have, and I have done that, is making the world premiere of a piece and knowing these are two concerts of this piece in one, meaning it's the first and the last. Nobody will ever hear this piece again. And it's so distressing because you think the composer, no matter who it was, put so much effort in creating this piece of art, and it's just not relating to people. And if I knew, by the way, how the perception taste of classical music will change over time,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm probably very mildly old-fashioned in the sense of I don't know whether as a tool, whether quarter tone will get us anywhere, intonation. Meaning overly used. As an expression, oh yeah. Oh yes, as an expression. But no, I mean, don't write a piece in quarter tones because it's...
Well, I don't. I want to talk about something which is quite interesting. You're conducting Mahler 9 in Oregon, coming up in May. And this broadcast will probably happen around the time you're conducting it. Mahler 9 was not a popular piece in 1912 when Bruno Walter did it with the Vienna Philharmonic. And then other people did it here and there. And then the Hitler time came. And it really wasn't until, I think, Horenstein and Lenny and others took up this music that it became a fact that hopefully you'll have a full house in Oregon for your Mahler 9. Why?
Well, probably because there is a slew of pieces that people at the time, when they happened, they didn't understand it, or later came a time when the piece disappeared. Mahler 9, yes, it was not popular, and of course the Vienna Philharmonic was up in arms against the piece because it was so, at the time, dreadfully complicated. That they simply didn't, and it also it's Mahler, it's long. So all these components, but I mean, we all know, for example, the fact that this St. Matthew's Passion by Mr. Bach, which is undoubtedly one of the greatest pieces ever conceived.
Yes.
And if Mr. Mendelssohn wouldn't have kind of led the charge...
20 years old.
Yeah, and said, hey, listen, this is it. Probably we would still know it, but that's the thing with classical music. I wish I would have an answer, and I wish I would see things that I think in 30 years people are going to understand, but
you've
all I can do is immerse myself comes to modern scores. Doesn't need to be a world premiere. Modern scores where I immerse myself with everything that I have and I try to make the case. I mean, last piece I conducted as a world premiere was here at CIM, Keith Fitch, a piece called Ali. And I thought, that piece does something, and it's just one example, does something that I consider a quality of composers, which is, especially when you work with students, you have quite an amount of rehearsal that you don't have with a professional orchestra.
Correct.
And you go into a lot of detailed work. Anyway, And the thing that Keith's piece did for me, and I think for the students as well, is at first it was like, oh my God, this is hard and this is very, very this, or whatever you thought. And the piece over time grew on all of us. Also because we got better at playing it, but it grew on us. And at the end, it was sheer enjoyment of just making the case for a composer who is one of our own. But it's just, I'm utilizing that because it's a vivid example of something that just happened. It happened over time to many other pieces that I had the pleasure of conducting that are absolutely contemporary.
Yes. You know, I find this fascinating to talk about because you pinpointed something. From that person somehow comes something, that person or any person whose music may last, comes something that will hit a chord, a harmony in the spheres, that will rise up. I must say, in your conducting, it is so alive and so magical, the experiences that I have had and look forward to having. So, Carlos Kalmar, thank you so much for being on Interplay. This is a wonderful conversation.
Real pleasures. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you so much. This is Michael Shapiro for Interplay Conversations in Music. Thank you for joining us.